this particular psalm, Psalm 7, is longer than the other psalms we looked at. It's 18 verses. And when I begin to examine it, I am aware that a lot of the themes are the same themes of the first 6 psalms. And so a question I will look to discuss at the end. So as in the past, I look to present for 20 minutes and then talk together for about 10. The question is, what is distinctive about this psalm? Why add this psalm? And another way to frame it is, what would be the title that you would give this psalm? You can see I gave it a title called Defiant Before Falsehood, but that's my 3rd title. I keep changing the title. I thank Eric for putting up this one from last night. So at the end, what I look to discuss with you is what's distinctive about Psalm 7 from the other 6, and what title would you choose for this psalm? A little word about translation before I begin to read the psalm to you, and that is I spend a lot of time with the translation. I look at many other translations, and I'm left with a certain tension. There's 2 different approaches to translation. One is to make it precise with the Hebrew, and the other is to make it more fluid. You can't do it precisely to the Hebrew because every language is structured differently grammatically, and you can't also convey in a translation the multiple possible understandings of a word. So as we go through this the second time, I'll point out some of those translation decisions. But what I will point out to you even before I read it is that this psalm can be divided equally into thirds. It's 18 verses. The first 6 are the speaker addressing God. The middle 3 describes his foe. And the last third describes what he sees as his hoped for resolution in dealing with his foe. In each of these 3 components, there are repetitions of words that highlight how they are a unit, as well as some words that will connect the units to each other. Just as one example, in the first unit, the first 6 verses, you have twice the expression Adonai Elohai in verses 2 and 4, ever present one, my God. You have twice the word rodef, pursuer, verses 2 and 6. You have twice the word matzil or hatzileni in verses 2 and 3. And you have twice the word im. So that there are repetitions of words that are part of the artistry of the poet to emphasize a key theme. So if you look at those key words, my God, my pursuers, save, are, if you will, touchstones for the message as well. With that, let me begin and I'll read it to you, and then I'll go back and I will share with you some of the challenges. Shigayon of David, which he's saying to Adonai concerning Cush the Benjaminite. Adonai, my God, in you I have sheltered. Save me from all my pursuers and deliver me, lest the tormentors like a lion tear up my soul, rending it into pieces with no deliverer. Adonai, my God, if I have done this, if there is wrongdoing in my palms, if I have paid back my ally with evil or oppressed my foes without cause, then may the enemy pursue my soul and overtake and trample my life down to the ground, making my glory reside in the dust. Arise, Adonai, in your anger, loom high in indignation against my foes. Arouse on my behalf the justice that you ordained. When a congregation of people surround you, return above to the heights. Adonai, who will bring people to trial? Judge me, Adonai, according to my innocence and integrity, which are mine. Please put an end to the evil of the wicked and fortify the righteous. Probing the heart and conscience is the righteous God, my shield. Upon God who saves the upright in heart. God is a righteous judge, El, who waxes indignantly every day. If one does not return to God, God sharpens the divine sword, bends the bow and aims it. God has prepared the tools of death. Plain arrows will activate as flaming ones. Behold, the sinner hatches wrongdoing, conceives plots and gives birth to lies. A pit the sinner digs and makes deeper and falls into the self-made trap. His plots will return upon his head, and on his skull his violence will descend. I will give thanks to Adonai in accordance with God's righteousness. Let me hymn Adonai's name most high. So as you can see, again, the psalm is into thirds. And I will say, even at the outset, and then I'll start at the beginning, there are a couple of things that I find distinctive about this psalm. One is the confidence of the psalmist. In contrast to Psalm 6, where he's deeply anguished, feeling worthless, here he seems to be confident that he is good. That's a change in tone. And the other, which is going to be a focus in this analysis, is verses 15, 16, and 17, which is kind of the punchline and somewhat of a new punchline. And that is that the sinner's undoing is his own wrongdoing, that it's inevitable that she will fail. Now, what goes around comes around, as the saying goes, is almost like a natural rule that's conveyed in this punchline toward the end, and that's also a little different. So let me begin at the top. This word shigayon, that's the Hebrew, a shigayon of David, does not appear in any other psalm. It does occur once else, only in one other place in Tanakh, and that's in Habakkuk. And it's there not clear as well what a shigayon is. Rashi says it might be a musical instrument. The traditional translation is that it's from shkia, and that is a mistake or an error of David, which he's concerning. So there's a mistake that David made, and I'll tell you in a moment that traditional understanding. Asher sar ladonai, which he's saying to God on the matter of Cush, or on the words of Cush, the Benjaminite. Now, it's not clear who this Cush is. Cush is like Cushi. It can be in Hebrew, a person who's dark-skinned. That's how a dark-skinned person is called a Cushi. Somebody from Yemen in more later on would be called Cushi because they were dark-skinned. But it's not clear historically what this moment is. There are 13 times in the 150 Psalms that are identified with a historic moment, largely in David's life. So you saw, for instance, in Psalm 3, that was identified with David being pursued by his son Avshalom. And traditionally, that theme of David in hiding from his tormentors are often identified with Avshalom and that pursuit. And here, the pursuer, or the shki'ah, classically, in that it's in the Talmud. In Moed Katan 16b, this psalm comes up, and it's juxtaposed with Psalm 18. Psalm 18, David marks Saul's death. Saul, the first king, appointed by the prophet Samuel, by God's guidance, at a certain point in his life, it's after he doesn't kill the king of Amalek, he becomes very unstable, and he will pursue David as a potential rival. And it's a problem for the rabbis. So what's the shkiah of David? And in the Talmud, they say his mistake was that he wasn't fully sad when Saul died in Psalm 18. So in Psalm 18, David celebrates the death of Saul, but the rabbis say Saul was even more righteous than David in his personal life. And we can, as an aside, say that's not a high bar in terms of a personal life, and that he was appointed by God. And so this is a psalm of mourning Saul. That's been the traditional mode, but there are a number of other alternatives. The Septuagint is the first Greek translation of the Bible. It's done in Egypt in the 2nd and 3rd century, and they identify this moment with another kush, a messenger. And this messenger is the one who was sent to announce to David that his son Avshalom had died. So that messenger on the words of the Cush. But what is David upset about? And the word shigayon can also be like meshuga, right? What's he crazed over? What's he obsessing over? Here it could be the death of his son Avshalom, who was killed by his officer Yoav. And Yoav had orders not to kill Avshalom. Avshalom got caught in this tree, and the general, Yoav, comes along and stabs him 3 times and then puts him in a pit. Those images of stabbing, of a pit, are contained within this psalm. Last, we don't know what is the historical context. So Jonathan Alter in his translation of Berkeley, or Martin Cohen, my friend, his translation of Psalms will just punt and say, we don't know the historical context. All right, I took a long time to say that, which doesn't leave a lot of time, but some time for me to go back now through the Psalm and point out some of the key passages that I had to deal with in terms of translating. One little thing that verse 3, lest the tormentor like a lion tear up my nephesh, rending it into pieces with no deliverer. Most translations use nephesh as life. Some, like the Art Scroll, does soul. I put in soul because I want to make it more primal, and because the relationship to God is on that nephesh level. So let me skip ahead, though there's a lot of things I could say, to the last third. And that begins with verse 13. So if one does not return, and here's a problem in translation. I put God in parentheses, but in Hebrew, there are no capitals on pronouns. So you don't get a capital he or a capital you. And therefore, this is of note, verses 13 and 14 in some translations are not about God, but about the evil person. So let me show you the 2 alternatives. 12 ends that second segment. God is a righteous judge, El who waxes indignantly every day. If one does not return, then you can understand it because it's again he. He sharpens the divine sword, bends the bow and aims it. And then again, he and 14, velo, and to him, or he has prepared the tools of death. Plain arrows will activate his flaming ones. Behold, now 15 is clearly focusing on the sinner. But do know, as an example, verses 13 and 14 in half of the books I looked at say that that refers to the sinner. In half the books, it refers to God preparing vengeance against the sinner. So again, what I'm focusing on in this little moment is the challenge of translation. No capital pronouns. And either is possible, which also means that the psalmist could intentionally be creating ambiguity. It can either be read verses 13 and 14 as threat. I'm scared because my opponent is sharpening his sword, or it could be confidence. I am reassured that God is sharpening the sword to punish. And that's the beauty of poetry, is ambiguity. And 13 and 14, which begin this final section, which is how will this all get resolved, begins with, in fact, Benjamin Siegel calls this psalm, he's one of the translators I like, he calls this certainty, uncertainty. And perhaps it's due to that ambiguity. And then the 15 and 16 and 17, I like a lot. There's in the Hebrew even more images of three stages that are birth related. Behold, the sinner hatches, yichabel, conceives, that's the same word for pregnancy, hara, vayaled, and gives birth. So there's the sense of in stages, it's all cooking to create something that is ultimately shaker, a lie. What's giving birth is deceit, lies. And then again in stages, two stages, verse 16, bor kara v'yechaparehu, and this gets translated all over the place in terms of what's the difference between kara and lichaper. They're both synonyms for digging. So here I translated a pit. The sinner digs and makes deeper. And then the punchline, vayipol b'shachat yif'al, and he falls into the hole, the trap that he had actualized, that he had made. So he falls into his own trap. Verse 16 seems to indicate that punishment is self-made, that the liar ultimately is creating a trap that he's going to fall into, his own trap. And then 17, with this language that has this quality of literally beating him over the head. Yashuv amalo barosho, and amal are labors. Here, translated as plots, it can be mischief. It goes back to verse 15. All the things that he's hatched. You find in verse 15, right in the middle, that same word, amal. Again, repetitions of words are emphasis. They return upon his head, and on his skull is kad, on his skull, Hamas is the word for unbridled violence, will descend. So this is a dangerous foe who ultimately plotted violence, and it's going to come back onto his own head. You know, he put it up, and you have this other image of going up and down. But there is two last things to point out before sharing. and that is verse 13. Im lo yashuv, if one does not return. So there is the image of the possibility of repentance. It's not all laid out linearly. The sinner can do teshuvah. And the same images of God who can leave, that shuv will be repeated for God earlier. If people crowd around you, God, to speak ill of me, just depart. But here, the beginning of this last segment, the last third, it's conditional if one does not return. So to pull this together before I invite you to share some responses, is I have found in this psalm a sense of self-confidence that's distinctive. I have felt in this psalm this opening of teshuvah, of repentance, and last, an emphasis that the sinner will do him or herself in, that ultimately that's the natural order, but more, it's God's order. That's how God created the world. So we have some minutes, only with one comment per participant. What's one comment, a sentence or two, that in hearing this psalm and looking at Psalm 7, what for you grabbed you? Or what would be the title you would choose for this psalm? Okay, let me open it up to make sure that I can
There.
see
Can you hear?
everybody.
This is Jennifer Berman. I have a question, really.
Yes, Jennifer.
It's a word I see many times, but in number 6, when you read this at the end, you didn't say Selah.
I didn't say what?
Selah, the very last word.
Oh, so we've gone, this is a reoccurring theme, Jennifer. Selah seems
Selah.
to be, it's a Hebrew word that's obscure. It seems to be notation for the psalm leader. And you can see here, it occurs only once. It occurs more often in other psalms at the end of the 6th verse. And that means the end of the first unit, because this one got divided into thirds. And it seems to be a musical notation of some kind, is what most commentators share. Psalms were put to Psalms were poems, and they were put to music. Thank you,
One
Jennifer.
of the Omer, Selah is used in the Omer too. There's a prayer. That's the first place I saw it.
Yeah,
but
it occurs throughout in other places. Yeah. Any who else would want to share a question or a comment?
I have a comment on line 17.
Alan.
Hi, how are you?
Alan, is this the first time you've joined the Psalm class?
Yes, I have. I just had a moment this morning, so it was great.
I'm so glad you're here. Go ahead.
Plot 17, I think, is a theme that justice, part of justice is that it turns around on yourself. If you do something wrong in a certain way, it comes back on you. And this was fresh on my mind from reading one of the 2 midrashim about how Cain died. It is said that he might have killed Abel with stones. So the rabbis say Cain died because his house fell on his head. And this is exactly what line 17 is saying. His plots will return upon his head, and on his skull, his violence will descend. And this is what the rabbis wanted to talk about, how your evil acts get returned in kind of the same way you dish them out. And that's kind of turnaround is fair play type of justice on that. And so that just kind of brought that home at the end there.
Thank you, Alan. I'll again thank you also for having taught that Cain story in our Parshat HaShavua group that Mimi Goldstein is hosting on Sundays. I encouraged others to participate. The rabbis have a phrase for what you're describing. It's called midah keneged midah, which means measure of opposite measure. So whatever somebody sought to do to others, that comes back to them. In English, we say what goes around comes around as another expression of that. Midah keneged midah. And that's part of the punchline here. So that's, the last line, 18, is kind of a closing. I give thanks to Adonai, I trust in God's righteousness. But the real punchline is that verses 16 and 17 in terms of the resolution. And the resolution, as you emphasize, is it'll come back to haunt them. What they sought to do, the plots will fall on their heads. Their lies will come back and be used to hurt them. One last comment, anybody? We try to stay within the time frame.
Rabbi, I have one.
Okay, Ed, good to see you.
I don't think it applies, though, to recent things that have happened in our recent history. And I go back, there was a program Sunday night on 60 Minutes regarding the Holocaust and the artificial intelligence that's being done. If you haven't seen that, you should try to get that. It's a tremendous program. And the fact is that today, or this was mentioned back with Nazi Germany, the things that people do are by their own free will. And I don't see many of them who paid a price other than, than death before, but some did not die in the same kind of horrible way that they put other people to death.
So I saw that segment yesterday. I again share Ed's enthusiasm for that piece. It's the second half of 60 Minutes that deals with Holocaust survivors who have been filmed over a week each with kind of a hologram almost experience that you're sitting, you can ask them questions. And part of my association, as you raised that, Ed, is part of the message of one of those survivors is he has immortality. In fact, he had, one of the three of them have already died of these Holocaust survivors, but their words live on in contrast to their pursuers, the Nazis, whose names are in many ways and their lives extinguished. Their lives live on. And that's related to this theme in terms of good will ultimately, in the long run, triumph. One last piece that relates to what you shared, Ed, that got triggered, and then I'll pull it together. And that's verse 15, again, is so artful as poetry in terms of these three expressions of hatching the plot from birth, from pregnancy to birth. And for me, the image is, it's all kind of inner. The plotting is first all inside. You don't quite see it. It's self-contained and yet is intended to come out. And then it comes out as violence. But more, it comes out as an act of digging a pit for others to fall into, verse 16, that ultimately the evildoer falls into his own trap. That's just a very powerful image. So let me pull it together with my own self-consciousness of knowing that when you do tune in, and it makes me happy, every day we keep inching up. Today was 32 participants. That's Lave, that's Heart. And I am honored to have this opportunity to learn together. Verse 7 is the only psalm with this word shigayon, which in modern Hebrew is used to mean kind of obsessed with. And it's not clear in some what the historic moment is. And yet this psalm does have a different tone, a tone that is the same. Well, first, what's similar, all the psalms to this point, starting with Psalm 1, deal with good versus evil and the machinations of the evildoers that has to be overcome and will be with the righteous judge. That's the key theme to this point. And what is different here is that the psalmist has a quality of self-confidence. Judge me as you will, God, but you know that I have integrity. Seems to me to be the tone. And that the second piece that's different, those who are evildoers, midah keneged midah, measure for measure, what they sought to do with all their plotting will ultimately be the pit that they fall into of their own doing. So to all of us in this moment of expanding connectedness with Zoom, may we find our Seders meaningful with lowered expectations because it's a different kind of Seder. And at the same time, know it's a unique moment, hopefully. It'll be the only time that we're confined in our homes the way they were on the night before departing from Egypt. May our departure come sooner than later. And in the meantime, may we be blessed with light in our dwellings and joy. To all, Chag Sameach. I look to see you next week when I will be doing it at least on Tuesday. I'm still debating whether on Wednesday as we move forward with Psalm 8. Chag Sameach.